Oh, yes, thank you for coming. We're brought here by the United Planet Faith and Science Initiative. And we're here today with another Climate Matters show, coming to you from COP21, the Conference of Parties, 21st Conference of Parties to the Kyoto Protocols. My name's Stuart Scott. I'm your host tonight.
And my name is Richard Cizik.
And I'm Catherine Hayhoe.
Now I have introductions for both of these. We'll show you some of their, a little bit of their credentials. These are, this is our web presence. We're at climatematters.tv, and we have several hashtags that went by rather quickly. But Dr. Catherine Hayhoe is an atmospheric scientist, director of the Climate Science Center at Texas Tech University, and one of the Time 100, that is one of the 100 most influential people on Earth in their 2014. Their 2014 poll.
Yes.
Well, that's when she got the award. She still is in my book. And Reverend Richard Cizik, he's president of the New Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good, and also one of the Time 100 in 2008, but he's still on my top 100 list.
Thank you.
And he is also the one of the 2015 winners of the Purpose Prize, which we'll ask him about in a little bit, because I had not heard of the Purpose Prize before I learned that Richard had. May I call you Richard?
You certainly may. I wish you will.
Thank you. And may I call you Catherine?
Of course.
Okay, good. So we have Reverend Richard Cizik, and Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, or Catherine, with us. They're both rather informal people, I've discovered. And today's topic is climate change, acceptance, and avoidance among evangelical Christians. Now, I know so little about evangelical Christianity, I can hardly even get the word out. It's too many syllables for me. So all I know is that where I live, there are evangelical ministries popping up all over. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder whether, Richard, you can tell us a little bit about the evangelical movement in America first.
Glad to. The term actually comes from the Greek evangelion, meaning good news. And so evangelicals are that division, in fact, the majority of Protestants in America, who believe in the good news. Pollsters over the years have found them to be 25% of the voting population of America, and more than that if you count children, and evangelicals have a lot of children. So we may number somewhere between 70 and 100 million in America. If you take the higher figure, that's 1/3 of all Americans are evangelicals. And here's a quick way to factor them out by polling. One, they are believers in the Bible as the Word of God. That's called biblicism. Two, they teach they need to be born again. That's conversionism. And then lastly, they are evangelistic, or into evangelism, and they believe that you relate faith to all of life. And so those three factors are the best way, polling-wise, to figure out who these people are and pull them out.
Now, that third point was very interesting, because when you said they were evangelists, I expected that they are trying to get others into their movement, but you said that they consider all of life part of the movement.
Yeah, that would be the best understanding. Historically, a lot of evangelicals were perceived to be fundamentalists. And fundamentalism became a form of kind of derogatory a term of sorts, and that was because of some of its proclivities, you know. And so there was a joke, I probably shouldn't tell it, I will anyway, that fundamentalism was known for not a lot of fun, a whole lot of damn, and not much mental. And so the evangelical movement, well, I was associated for 28 years with the National Association of Evangelicals. It was formed in 1942, and by the turn of the last century, that is 2000, 2001, evangelicals had grown from being a small division of the Protestant world in America to the largest part of Protestantism in America. So fast-growing, influential.
What fraction of, say, Christians in America, or what fraction of the population in America can you count as evangelical?
What percent? Well, they're 25% of the adult population. So you have approximately 70 to 80 to 100 evangelicals, depending on how you ask the question. You have 60 million Catholics in America. You have a smaller number of mainline Protestants and Jews and others. So the largest religious category in America are really the evangelicals, no question.
Wow.
But it's often hard to categorize because there aren't many churches that actually have evangelical on the church. So people attending a Baptist church may view themselves as evangelical, but some in the same church may not. People attending an Anglican or an Episcopal church might also sometimes see themselves as evangelical. So it's a loose term, but broadly defined, about 600 million people around the world fall under the banner of evangelicals.
Now, it's interesting because the image that I'm showing, I was trying to find an image for the evangelical movement or the evangelical church, if there was a church. And this was the most attractive image I got, but apparently it's some church somewhere, I guess in the United States. There is no, it's not a sub.
It's not a denomination.
Not a denomination. No. Now, there are some 50 denominations or thereabouts in the National Association of Evangelicals, which is an umbrella organization, which I worked for a number of decades. But it's true. It's hard to factor these out. It's not easy. For example, African Americans, they are evangelicals by theology, but they may not be by practice. They might not even call themselves. The largest Protestant denomination in America, the Southern Baptist Convention, they are by theology evangelicals, but they might not even use the term of
That's
themselves.
very interesting.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
In fact, evangelical is often used more to describe, these days in the United States, to describe views on social and political issues.
Sadly so.
Yes. So Rich was giving 3 characteristics of evangelicals, but nowadays it almost seems like one of the fourth defining characteristic of evangelicals in the United States, as many people have it in their heads, especially people who are familiar with climate change and with the COP process. Evangelicals are seen as rejecting the science of climate change.
Now, that's okay.
But we will go there in more detail. It is not being evangelical that makes us reject it.
Now, I was going
Not
to...
because we're evangelical, but
Yes.
I think it's important to point out that 40 to 60%, depending on the state, of Republicans, that is the GOP, constitute the evangelicals.
Yes.
And so the reason why this political ideology, sometimes called evangelicalism, wrongly so from my point of view, is important is because we know some of the holdouts, the biggest skeptics, if you want to use that term, of climate science comes within the Republican camp. And evangelicals are the biggest supporters of that camp. And so the significance politically of evangelicals on this issue cannot be underestimated.
In my notes before the program, one of the things I noted is that America is known to be very strictly a nation of separation of church and state. And yet, we have this one particular area where the politics and the religion are intimately intertwined and not necessarily for the benefit of the people. So it's very, very interesting what's going on.
But they've been the most denialist, if I'm to use that term. I know Catherine doesn't like it.
Dismissive.
Dismissive. Let's use that term.
Yeah.
They've been the most dismissive, and yet, without getting too far ahead of ourselves, the most recent poll that came out of the University of Michigan cites a jump of some 16% over the last 4 months of the evangelicals, up to 65% who believe in the reality of climate change. Now, what percentage of that percentage actually believe that we are causing it, significantly so, is to be determined. But
About 2/3.
about 2/3, okay.
Yeah.
But that's a jump. It's a huge jump. And pollsters are beginning to look at this and saying, wow, this wasn't supposed to happen. It's unexpected. Why? Was it the papal visit of Pope Francis? Was it the weather? Housewife who looks out her window and says, hey, it's changing?
Or is it all those tornadoes down the street?
Oh, yeah. Or what was it? Why this jump? And we'll see if it holds out over time, because this group has been the holdout.
Yes. But we have to clarify here, though, that there are, again, 600 million evangelicals around the world. The United States has between, did you say 60 to 100 million, depending on who answers what question. So roughly, 1/6 to 1/4 of evangelicals are in the United States, but many more are outside the United States. And what might surprise a lot of people is that the World Evangelical Alliance has a statement and a position on climate change, and it is a wonderful position. If you go to evangelicals outside of the United States, and I just spent most of today at an evangelical conference downtown Paris in St. Michael's Church with French, Swiss, British, and Spanish colleagues. If you go to these other evangelical churches and other evangelical events, the vast majority of people there are very concerned about climate change. So this unique linking of evangelicals per se with dismissing the reality of climate change and the urgency for action is a very uniquely American feature that is beginning to spill over into other countries, but comes from one place.
What would you say is the root of that dismissive attitude? Can you get to what is causing it?
Well, Rich has already started alluding to that, and that is the fact that several decades ago...
Now, this is the first one of these shows I've done where I feel like I actually am not needed. I can leave and they'll carry on without
Just pass your notes before you leave. Okay. So a number of decades ago, back in the 80s, that was when Christianity, and especially conservative Christianity, people set out to deliberately politicize it. The issue of abortion became the central issue in many elections, and if you called yourself a Christian, you had to vote for the certain political party. Before that, it was up to you. And that's still the way it is in most countries. Like, I'm from Canada, and I have never, ever in Canada heard a Christian leader say, you should vote for this party. Of course, we have 5, so we have a bit more of a variety to vote for. So because of the politicization of our faith, then it's come to the point where now, for many people, our statement of faith becomes dictated not just by what our church says, not just by what the Bible says, but what our political party says.
Some people think the GOP, the Grand Old Party, really is God's own party. The GOP.
For the international audience, the GOP is the Republican
Party. And there is that association, sad to say. I'm a progressive evangelical. I still keep the term evangelical, but it was frankly because of my activism on climate change and some progressive causes that I was asked to leave the association that I'd worked for many years. And so there's a certain amount of tolerance for deviation, but not too much. But that's changing.
It is.
I had a conversion, as I mentioned, to climate change in 2002. The association just announced this year. It's been, 13 years later. But the Association of Evangelicals has now come out with a strong statement, paralleling what the international evangelicals are saying. So whether this will begin to influence politics is another question. It's another step, but we hope so.
Not whether, but when.
Yeah, I think that's true. Because, you see, if that third part is true, we allow our faith to influence our worldview. You have to allow the Scriptures then to influence your worldview on this topic.
But when the world starts to change radically, then that has to influence your worldview too.
Absolutely.
You know, I did a trip through the South with a bunch of electric vehicles trying to set records, and we were in a fast food place in Arkansas, and a woman comes in, walks over to me and says, "Are you with that truck out there?" We had a big banner on the side of the truck, and I said, "Yes, we were the Ride the Future tour," and she says, "Can I interview you?" Great, sit down. And at the end of her interviewing me, I said, "You know, I'm on this trip because I want to give a talk about climate every day through the southern part of the United States, the Bible Belt. And do the people out there get it?" And she said, "Well, that depends on who you're talking about. If you're talking about the farmers in the field, the Okies in the mountains who have 6th grade education but are out there working hard in the fields, they get it. But if you're talking about the office workers in air-conditioned buildings, they don't get it." Now, let's segue a bit. Catherine, you've written a book. Can you just tell us a few words about your book?
Oh, there it is. I wrote this book several years ago with my husband. My husband is not only a linguistics professor, but he is also the pastor of our church. We go to a non-denominational evangelical church. And when we first got married, it took us a while to figure out that we were on opposite sides of the fence on this issue.
That could be difficult.
Yes. I had come from Canada. I had never met anybody who didn't think that climate change was real. He grew up in the U.S., in the South. His dad was a Republican politician. He went to a Baptist school. He had never met a Christian who did think it was real. So we never thought to ask, because why would we? And it was about 6 months after we got married that we realized that we did not agree on this issue. But he's a really smart person.
I want to say who won, but you're getting
No,
that.
there's no winning. There's no winning. There's
Good.
compromise. That is the secret to successful marriage. I feel like I learned more than he did. And that is the honest truth, because we started at the beginning and we went through step by step the evidence for climate change. Now, he has a PhD, he understands statistics, he understands science, so we could get really into it. And I realized as a scientist there were a lot of basics that I didn't know yet. A lot of questions people had that I had never asked what the answer was to. But the biggest thing I learned was that people who don't think that climate change is real, or who dismiss the science or dismiss the need for action, they are not doing it because of lack of intelligence at all. People are very smart. People are very savvy. People are good at making decisions. People understand risk. And people's hearts are in the right place. That was the biggest thing I learned, because if we have one widespread myth or misconception that I could dismiss if I could, it's that you have to be a certain type of person to care about climate change. We have to be a green, liberal, tree hugger, possibly earth worshiper, definitely with a shrine of Al Gore in the corner. I've often been called the high priestess of Al Gore, which I take as a compliment. So the stereotype is we have to be a certain type of person. And this stereotype can be true whether we are that type of person or not. But it's a lot harder if you're talking to anybody over the age of about 12, if you're trying to convince them to be a different person in order to care about climate change, rather than if you're saying to them, you know what, you already are exactly the type of person you need to be to care about climate change. Let me just connect the dots. That is a whole different picture.
Connect the dots. I like that. Now, I was going to ask you, how do you do what you do, since you've been judged to be very influential in doing this and connect the dots? You try to get people to connect the dots.
Yeah.
You know, this television show coming from the UN, piggybacking on the press conference facilities of the United Nations, FCCC, I explain to people what it is, that it's an attempt to connect the dots for people. We're not trying to influence the negotiations going on this campus. We're trying to influence the people who don't understand that there are negotiations going on.
Or why they're happening, or who are trying to prevent them. Yes, go ahead.
I say to people three things. I say, one, you have to have a vision for this. That's to see and think more clearly about climate change. And it's biblical in its biblical context. So see and think more clearly, just as Jesus said, don't just see, he said, behold. We need to behold the world differently. That is to say, our responsibility isn't just to live and die and be with Jesus forever. It's to rather to be co-partners with God in the redemption and renewal of all of creation. That's the vision. The strategy is to care more deeply, and the tactics are to act more boldly. But I say all three.
Now, I will seize one word from what you said, which gave me a little bit of a little mini enlightenment, little mini epiphany. You said, behold. And I have a tendency to analyze words, to be and hold together. So you're being and holding.
Yeah, and that's what the scriptures teach from Genesis to Revelation, which is to care for the earth, be stewards of it, all the way to the Apostle John's revelation in the last book, which is, well, let's not be among those who are willing to destroy the earth. Because, in effect, that admonition there is, I will destroy those who destroy the earth.
Yes, and we all need to be stewards. And people say, when did you get started doing what you're doing? And I say, well, my parents started me out before I was born by naming me Stuart.
That's good.
Yeah.
Now, let's switch to your book, Richard. Let's see if we can get it up there.
Oh, I should mention, so I wrote that book with
please.
my husband. That was the culmination of our years of discussion.
Oh, so you didn't even get to your book?
No, I didn't. I kind of lost where we were going with that.
There we go.
Yes.
Take it.
Oh, well, that was it. So after years of discussion, and after, like I said, I feel like I learned more than he did, he said, well, you know, I have all these friends, all these people in church asking me questions, and every time I have to go home, we have to find the answer, give it to them. Why don't we just write a book about it?
And just hand out the book.
Yes, and just next time they ask a question, just
Or
here you go.
give them the Amazon link or whatever.
Exactly.
Okay. So, Richard, would you tell us a little bit?
I also co-authored a book. It's called, what is it called? Engaging Religious Communities Abroad, a New Imperative of U.S. Foreign Policy. I had a co-author.
You didn't have that all memorized now? No.
I do, really. Co-authored with Scott Appleby, a professor of fundamentalism at Notre Dame, just an excellent man and scholar on these topics. And so what we did in this 2-year project with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs is to assemble scholars, politicians, policy wonks, others together to say what needs to be done to engage the world differently on this topic of faith. And we came up with a phraseology that was championed by our press and other people called the God Gap. And essentially what we're saying is that all of these aforementioned groups, diplomats at the State Department, politicians on Capitol Hill, even academics and all, have what is a misunderstanding about lived faith internationally, hence the God Gap. And we were able to substantiate, that's what the book about, it's the religion trends that are shaping the world, and then we offer suggestions. And President Obama, a friend of the Chicago Council of Global Affairs, where he gave his first foreign policy speech, sent it out to all of our embassies, saying every embassy needs to have one person who champions religious freedom and understands lived religion in that particular country. And among the issues that we examine is not just war and peace, although that's the biggest part of the book, is how religious communities together can begin to grapple with the issues of the 21st century, of which climate change is surely the biggest.
Now let's take a moment. I would like at this point, a lot over halfway, to take time for a non-commercial break. You're used to commercial breaks on conventional TV. So the non-commercial break is I'm going to pitch something to you, but it's not for sale. I'm giving it away. I've come up with an idea for a Nobel Peace Prize for Sustainable Development. Now, you can't have a Peace Prize for a field, so we need candidates. You can have organizations or individuals. We've got one organization and 2 individuals. The organization is the Club of Rome. Now, why the Club of Rome? The Club of Rome commissioned a report in the early 1970s called The Limits to Growth. And that really started the sustainability movement because they had this huge computer model on the then supercomputers of the day, which kept, when they programmed it to try to predict trends, macro trends, population, forests, ocean life, the ecosphere. And it always indicated that human population would crash unless they adjusted the assumptions to assume that we actually dealt with our environmental problems quickly. Now, that was in 1972 it was published. They've updated it since. There's a 2002 update, I believe, and it's still tracking their predictions. So but it is the most, or one of the most quoted journals, books in the literature, and all of the scholarly literature about sustainable development. So it is one of the roots. So the organization that commissioned it, the Club of Rome, is one of the nominees. The second is a gentleman whose name is not a household word, Dr. Herman Daly. Dr. Daly was, for 6 years, a World Bank senior economist in their environmentally sustainable development department, and he is known to be the father of ecological economics. There's a big misconception that the economic system that we have is the only one possible. Not. But we've been using that one system for so long, and it has taken command of the universities of the world, and so we no longer realize there are alternatives. Well, ecological economics starts in a place that says you have to consider that the limits of the earth are the limits of the human economy. Whereas the current system, which is actually technically called neoclassical economics, says there are no limits. We run out of fish, we'll eat something else. There is a flaw in the system, and that's why we are in very serious condition, because the current economic system, the only word, their pseudo-religion is growth. If you grow, it'll solve all problems. Whereas ecological economics says there are limits to growth. Now, the third candidate needs no introduction, Pope Francis. Pope Francis, who spends every day probably teaching and preaching about ecology in one form or another, and fairness and equity and all of the human values, the things that make us most human, came out with something called the Papal Encyclical this year, which was the English translation I have is 91 pages long, and it is very enlightening. And he really indicates that we have an economic problem, that the ecological problem, the roots are an economic set of roots. And I found this wonderful picture of Pope Francis, so I'm going to start calling him the Green Pope. Okay. Now, these three candidates are integral to the prize. So please, go to NP4SD. Here, we'll run it by you again. The Nobel Peace Prize for Sustainable Development. And it's at NP4SD. Now, if you're out there in the TV audience, in the webcast audience, and you're doing Facebook, please segue on over to NP4SD, and for the public, you do a nomination, you do an endorsement, but there are millions of qualified nominators, so go and check out and see if you're one, because there are millions of them who don't know that they are.
Very
Now,
interesting.
Let's get back to the discussion.
By the way, I would follow up on that by simply saying that survey data already reveals that Pope Francis is influential. He's influential on Republicans and on other regular worshipers. In other words, his voice is more influential than secular voices to those two communities. Regular worshipers, naturally, they would be most receptive, and Republicans. Isn't that interesting? Already the data reveals faith leaders hold a value that others don't have.
Yeah.
I happen to be here at Compliments and hosted by the Global Peace Initiative of Women. This is my 6th such event on environmental causes, beginning in Copenhagen, and so I'm proud to tout that as a methodology for challenging, the ignorance, the political ideologies and others that are opposed to what we're about here. In other words, faith leaders together, interfaith leaders, challenging their respective communities, including my own, the Evangelicals, to do what we should be doing together.
Now, I'd like
engaging religious communities abroad.
We only have a few minutes left. I'd like to move towards really rubber meeting the road. How, if we cut out this last few minutes and made an independent YouTube out of it, how do we change people's hearts and minds about climate change?
Well, I don't think we have to change people's hearts, just their minds. That's the big difference.
So read your book. Well,
not necessarily.
No, I'm teasing.
So people often say, well, I have Uncle so-and-so, or I have my colleague so-and-so, or I even have my next-door neighbor. They may think climate change is real, but they may not care. They may not think it's real. How do I talk to them? Often they say, what's something I could tell them? In other words, looking for a scientific fact or a piece of information that would just change their mind. And the sad thing is that information, and especially arguing over information, won't change anybody's minds. If it's already a very polarized issue, which climate change is, then all it does is reinforce our previous opinions. So what I say to them instead is I say, all right, you have to have something in common with this person, otherwise you wouldn't know them. So start with what you have in common. Are you both parents? Do you both live in the same place so you care about the same current issues in the place where you live? Do you know that they're concerned about, say, national security? Do they have a child, or are they formally in the armed forces? Are they someone who goes to church, who has a specific faith or religion? Or are they somebody who enjoys hunting or fishing, or worries about their kid who has asthma? So connect over something that you genuinely care about and they really already care about. It's already in their hearts. And then share from your heart saying, I'm worried about climate change, and I'm worried about it because of this value we already share. I'm worried about it because we worry about these poor people who are being affected by all these droughts and severe cyclones. I'm worried about them too. Or yes, I'm worried about my child too. So connect the dots. And then this is the most important point, and it's something that took me as a scientist a long time to learn. We scientists are great about talking about the issue, talking about the problem, talking about the challenge, and then dropping the mic and walking away. And what I've learned is that if we talk to anybody about any problem or challenge, anything that can be completely innocuous, anything from weight loss to climate change, and we talk about the problem, but we don't offer a tangible, viable, acceptable, and inspirational solution that they can agree with and buy into and even accomplish themselves, their acceptance of the reality of the issue is much lower. So we have to offer something that people can do.
I'd like you to offer a massively online, a MOOC online on this subject. And I'll take the time to take the class. Now, wow, that was a lot.
Can I add something?
Please.
Yeah.
I would simply say people move transactionally, psychologists say, from deny, I won't, to deliberate, I might, to design, I will, to doing, which is I am, and defending, I have. So it's that transactional process. Call them the 5 Ds. And for a lot of evangelicals, it's simply getting them from deny to deliberate. And once they deliberate in dialogue, they'll move to defending and doing.
If we can offer things to do that are consistent with our values.
We've exhausted all our time, unfortunately, and the UN is very strict about that. Thank you for coming to another Climate Matters show. Again, I'm your host, Stuart Scott. Here's my email address if you'd like to get in touch. And thanks to our guests coming live from Paris.
Thank you, Stuart.
Thanks, Stuart.